Buddy Rich and drummers. I read a great thing about Buddy Rich the other day. Apparently, when he died, sadly, obviously, he died after some surgery back in the late 80s.
Yeah.
He didn't make it. But apparently, as he was being prepped for the surgery, the nurse asked him, she said, "Is there anything you can't take, Mr. Rich?" And he said, "Yeah, country music." And allegedly, they were the last words he ever said.
I love it.
Very good.
It was. I think the line was, "Are you allergic to anything?"
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and he said country and western music. Yeah, something.
A friend of Simon Phillips had been shot, and he's in hospital. The nurse says that question to him. She says, "Are you allergic to anything?" He said, "Yes, bullets."
I mean, Brian was quite friendly with Buddy.
No, not at all. Every time I used to go to Ronnie's, I'd see Buddy every time he was at Ronnie's. I would always go, as you and I, Clem, would do. He was sort of like our hero, really.
He was flying with us, wouldn't he be?
Absolutely. And every time Pete King or Ronnie Scott, in fact, said, "Why don't you come round and say hello?" I said, "No, I'd rather not." Because you think he's being awkward. Anyway, Pete said, "Look, he's just had a heart attack. You should really, he's your hero. Come and see him." So I thought, right, I'll go in, say welcome, and then run away again, just in and out. Well, of course, he sort of sat down and he started talking, and he was a real charmer.
Yeah, exactly.
We had a wonderful time talking about touring, the problems of touring and looking after a band and things like that.
Yeah.
I loved him.
Yeah, he was fine. I must admit, he was great. The times I met him, he was charming. Mind you, didn't know he was a rock and roller, mind, but there you go.
That was actually how I got to know Brian, because I used to go to Ronnie's for the same reason, to see Buddy play, and I would see the entire Brian Bennett family, who had been given the royal seat, up against the kind of dilly rail that they had there, when they had that rail there, and Margaret would be with you, and Warren, and the rest of you, and I would be sitting on the raised section and looking across and thinking, "That's Brian Bennett from the Shadows. Fuck. Wow. Goodness." I wonder.
Ronnie used to be my manager.
And then one day I'm sitting in the office, and it was after Mark had done the music for Local Hero. He'd done the Local Hero music. And the phone goes, and this voice comes on. He says, "Hi, this is Bruce Welch from the Shadows." And on one of only 2 occasions in my career, I dropped the telephone into the waste bin, which was metal. And I was scrabbling about in the waste bin because Bruce Welch, fuck. So I get the thing out, and the Shads were playing at the Dominion. And they wanted to know if Mark would like to go along and play with them. Well, I mean, Mark would have crawled over broken glass to plant a rose in Hank Marvin's shit. So we agree. And he and I were driving down Oxford Street that evening. And I said to Mark, "What do you want to play?" And he said, "I've always wanted to play Atlantis." And Wonderful Land was the other one he wanted to do. So anyway, we get there. We're ushered into the dressing room, and that was when I first met Brian, kind of formally, having observed him at Ronnie's and actually seeing him. Shadows were the first group I ever saw play live in June of 1961, and I think you just joined them, Brian.
I remember you now.
Yeah. I was in the circle in '05.
You're talking about Ronnie's a lot. He used to be my band's manager in the early 70s. And so I used to go in that office around the back, that's in a sanctum. And a couple of things happened. One is he was always watching the horse racing, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He never won. He said, "I could stop a runaway horse just by putting money on it." And there was a curtain with a puller on the wall, covered a map of the world. And one day he wanted to demonstrate this, and he puts on a mock German accent and said, "Today, Frith Street. Tomorrow," he pulls the curtains open, "Frith Street."
I was in that back room with Pete one day, and he's kind of waxing lyrical and philosophical as he could be when he was not being grumpy. And he started banging the top of the desk, that desk you're talking about.
Yeah.
And he kept saying, and he looked up and he said to me, "Here." And I said, "What?" And he went, "Here." And I said, "What?" He said, "Here. It happened here." I said, "What happened?" He said, "Peter Sellars fucked Princess Margaret. Here." Here.
Was there a blue plaque?
No, a red one. Danger.
Tell you what was funny there. I mean, I was kind of, as I say, kind of involved with it on an altruistic basis. And I would go along every Friday night pretty much. And Princess Diana would come and she'd stand in the line outside with the Indian doctor that she had that relationship with.
Yes, yeah.
They would come in, no security, nothing, just come in and pay for the tickets like anybody else.
Right.
And people go, "Oh, fucking hell, look, that fucking hell." And there was a guy came in who paid for a membership with a credit card. And Pete saw this bloke produce the credit card, and he literally, his heart started going. He said, "It's the worst thing that ever happened in my life was the invention of the credit card." And because he couldn't, he was a cash business, of course.
Yeah.
But he's doing it.
It's a funny thing. Every time we do one of these recordings, that certain people always get mentioned. There's always a mention of Van Morrison, certainly Chuck Berry, and Ronnie Scott. Scott. Everyone's got Ronnie Scott stories. I used to work with Ronnie Scott. I used to record radio shows with him.
Yeah.
And he'd come to the studio with a pile of records in his arm, and they'd be scratched to buggery, these records, and virtually unusable. And we'd do the show, and he wouldn't have prepared anything, and he'd just make it up as we go along. He'd say, "Oh, we'll play that track, and then we'll go to that one." And then afterwards, I'd say, "Oh, here's the records," and give them back to him. So I can't take them now. I've got to go somewhere. I can't carry a bunch of records. Drop them round to the club. So, we were just in Greek Street, so I took them round to Friz Street. And I think I probably went the next day. And Pete, I rang the bell in the daytime, and Pete answered. And I said, "Well, these are Ronnie's records. He asked me to drop them round." And he went, "Okay." And he took them and he just threw them in the bin that was by the door. They're Ronnie's records. He went, "I don't care. He shit to me all week. I don't care." And he walked off.
I used to go up there pretty much every Friday night for many years with this friend John Elson and myself. And we would go down the road there was a dreadful Italian restaurant called La Capanina on Romilly Street, just down the road.
I know it.
And it was, oh God, horrendous. There were two working girls upstairs, and if you went in the wrong door, you'd get more than a cannelloni. And so we would go down there, and we would often go with whoever was playing at the club that week or that fortnight. I remember going. That was where I first met and got to know Elvin Jones really well. And Pete never had any spending money. He had to give all of his money from the club to Stella, his wife, who then gave him an allowance. And this didn't go up for something like 40 years. So he was on the same money as he had been 40 years before. And he had a tab at this restaurant, this Capanina place. The Capanina, the chef rarely turned up, which the owner, who said his name was Adolfo, but his real name was actually Eric, and he came from Ealing, and he had never been to Italy in his life. He would produce, and the place was full of the last remnants of the Soho gangsters that were still going, and most of them were rather a sad lot. Danny LaRue was in there almost every time I went. Georgie Fame would often be there, and we had some of the funniest evenings I've ever spent. And Pete would feign ignorance about things. One day he said to me, he'd just sold the club, and he's telling us that he'd been kept on as a consultant by Sally Green. And he said to me, he said, what's NI? I said, what? He said, NI. He said, what's that then? I said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, I got a pay slip today. He said, it's got this thing on it called NI. I said, oh, you mean national insurance? Well, what's that then? I said, you pay national insurance on your staff. He said, no, I don't. I said, yeah, you do. He said, no, I don't. He said, I don't pay my staff. I said, what? I said, of course you pay your staff. He says, no, I don't pay my staff because they steal off me.
What?
I said, fuck, that's where I've been going wrong all these years. If I just let my staff steal off me, I wouldn't have to pay them. And everybody in that place then had a scam going. The doorman had a scam with minicab drivers. The bar staff had a scam. Because if you have a cash business, you'll have scams. It just follows. And Pete's line was that he didn't know what national insurance was because he'd never paid it because he never paid the staff. And I said, well, that's because you've got an accountant that you pay cash. That was Mr. Shamsi, who I'm sure you'll remember, Mo, Indian gentleman.
Yeah.
The whole thing, how they never got closed down. I was constantly keeping the PRS off their back. The VAT people getting pianos.
They had a fire. One day I went in the club and there was this terrible smell coming down the stairs from the upstairs bit where all our gear was set up. It smelled like kippers. I walked up the stairs. It was black. They'd had a fire during the night. All our gear was ruined, charred, twisted and wet from the firemen. And we had a gig the next day. Had to borrow gear off Soft Machine to do a festival.
Yeah,
it was very hard.
yeah.
And Ronnie apologised about this thing. He said the fire was a year earlier than planned.
Pete told me this story. I asked him one day. I said, "Did you ever have a problem with protection? You know, the gangs and that in the 60s and so." And he says, "Well, one day," he says, "me and Ron were sitting in that back office that we're talking about, and he said these two tearaways came in, and they said, if you don't pay us £5 a week, we're going to smash your windows." And Ronnie leaned back in his chair and he said, "We haven't got any windows." This young fellow says, "Well, we'll smash your tables." And Ronnie said, "Oh, well, all right." He said, "Well, listen, we've got a board meeting tomorrow with our other director, Mr. Spot." And for those who don't know, there were two king gangsters in Soho at the time, Jack Spot and Billy somebody. And Jack Spot was a mate of Ronnie's dad, and they used to go betting up at White City on the dogs. So anyway, this young kid says to him, "Mr. Spot, do you mean Jack Spot?" And Ronnie said, "Yeah, he's our other director. He's our investor." And he said, these two blokes took off.
Yeah.
He says they ran down the street, they ran round the corner, never seen again. And of course, the word went out and they never, ever had any trouble. And in the corner in that back office was a large magnum of champagne, which Jack Spot had given them when they opened. And it had a little ticket round the neck, which said, "When you make a profit, you can open this bottle." And it remained there covered in dust.
Where is it now? Where's that bottle now?
You know, I don't know what happened to when Sally Green bought it. You know, a whole load of stuff, really quite interesting memorabilia, just disappeared. Like the Fagioli piano went, where it went. But there was all that. The desk where Princess Margaret enjoyed herself, that went. You could have got money for that at Sotheby's.